carriage wheel snapped in half on the narrow mountain road, and Eleanor Winters felt her whole body lurch sideways as the vehicle tipped into the ditch. Rain hammered down without mercy, and thunder rolled across the black hills like a warning. She pushed the door open with both hands and stumbled out into the storm, her boots sinking into cold mud, her heart pounding from the shock of the crash. The driver lay groaning near the front wheel, his leg twisted at an angle that made her stomach turn. There was no village in sight, no light, no shelter, only wind, rain, and darkness pressing in from every direction. She had been traveling to settle her late husband's business with a distant cousin in the Highlands, hoping the cold northern air might quiet the grief that had followed her for a full year. Instead, within her first hour on Scottish soil, she found herself soaked to the bone, kneeling beside an injured stranger on a road that seemed to lead nowhere. "Can you stand?" she shouted over the wind, gripping the driver's shoulder. He shook his head, his face pale, even in the dim light of the broken carriage lamp. "The horse bolted, my lady. I cannot walk on this leg." Eleanor looked around desperately. Far off, through the sheets of rain, she caught the faint outline of a tower rising against the sky, its stone walls catching a flicker of lightning. It was the only structure for miles. She made her decision in an instant, the way she always did, when there was no time for hesitation. "Stay here. I will find help. My lady, you cannot go alone into this storm. I will not leave you to die in a ditch," she said firmly. And before he could argue further, she was already moving, half running, half stumbling toward the distant tower, her cloak whipping violently around her legs. The walk felt endless, her shoes filled with water, her hands turned numb. Twice she fell on the slick grass and forced herself back up, driven by the image of the injured driver waiting in the cold. When she finally reached the iron gates of the tower, she was shaking so hard she could barely lift the heavy knocker. She struck it 3 times, then again, louder, desperation cutting through her exhaustion. The door opened not to a servant, but to a tall man, with dark hair plastered against his forehead, his shirt half undone, as though he had dressed in haste. His eyes were sharp and assessing, taking in her soaked clothing and trembling frame in a single glance. "Who are you?" he said, his voice low and edged with suspicion. "And why are you at my door in the middle of a storm?" "There has been an accident," Eleanor gasped, forcing the words out between breaths. "My driver is injured on the road below. He cannot walk. I need help, or he may die out there." For a moment, the man studied her, as though weighing whether to believe a single word, and then something in his expression shifted. He stepped back and called sharply into the house, and within seconds, 2 servants appeared, pulling on coats, grabbing lanterns, and a length of rope. "Show them the way," he ordered, and Eleanor, despite her exhaustion, turned immediately back into the rain to lead them. It took nearly an hour to bring the driver to safety. By the time they returned to the tower, Eleanor's legs could barely hold her weight, and the world had begun to tilt strangely at the edges. She remembered being led into a large hall with a roaring fire, remembered someone placing a blanket over her shoulders, and then very little else until she woke hours later, in an unfamiliar bed, sunlight struggling through heavy curtains. She sat up slowly, disoriented, and found a woman waiting nearby with a tray of tea and bread. "You gave us quite a fright, my lady," the woman said kindly. "You collapsed near the fire last night. His Grace insisted you be brought to a proper room, instead of left on a bench like a stray cat." "His Grace?" Eleanor repeated, her mind still foggy. "The Duke of Ravensmore," the woman said, as though the name should have explained everything. "You are in his home." Eleanor's stomach tightened. She had heard the name before, whispered in London drawing rooms, with a mixture of fascination and unease. Duke Alastair Ravensmore, a man known for his silence, his temper, and the tragedy that had driven him from society years earlier. She had never expected to find herself under his roof, wearing borrowed linens, owing him her driver's life. She dressed quickly in the clothes provided and made her way downstairs, following the sound of low voices until she found the Duke standing near a window, his arms crossed, studying the storm-battered hills outside. He turned as she entered, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "You are awake," he said finally. "I am," Eleanor answered, straightening her spine despite her nerves. "And I owe you my gratitude, Your Grace. Without your help, my driver might not have survived the night." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. You walked half a mile in a storm to save a servant's life. Most women of your standing would have stayed in the carriage and prayed for rescue. I am not most women, she said simply. Something flickered in his eyes, an emotion she could not name, had gone as quickly as it appeared. No, he said quietly, I do not believe you are. The conversation that followed was brief and formal, filled with careful words about her journey, her destination, and the damage to her carriage, which would take days to repair. He informed her, with obvious reluctance, that she would need to remain at the castle until proper transportation could be arranged. I understand this is an imposition, Eleanor said, sensing his discomfort. I will stay out of your way as much as possible. That will not be necessary, he replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. The castle is large enough for both of us to avoid each other entirely, should we wish it. Eleanor almost smiled at the bluntness of his words, but she held it back, unsure whether humor would be welcome in this house of shadows and silence. Instead, she nodded and excused herself, retreating to the room she had been given, her mind spinning with questions about the man who had opened his home to a stranger and now seemed determined to keep his distance. Over the following 2 days, Eleanor kept largely to herself, walking the castle grounds when the weather allowed, reading in the library when it did not. She learned from the servants, in fragments and whispers, that the Duke had lost his wife several years earlier, under circumstances no one wished to discuss openly, and that he had withdrawn from society ever since, running his estate with quiet efficiency but little warmth. She told herself this information did not matter, that she would be gone within a week and would likely never think of Duke Ravensmore again. Yet she found her thoughts returning to him more often than she wished to admit, drawn by the memory of his sharp eyes and the strange flicker of respect she had seen there, when she refused to be dismissed as fragile. On the third evening, unable to sleep, Eleanor wandered down to the library, long after the household had gone quiet. She expected to find it empty. Instead, she found the Duke seated by the fire, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, his eyes fixed on the flames with an intensity that suggested his thoughts were far from the room around him. Forgive me, she said quickly, already turning to leave. I did not mean to intrude. Stay, he said, surprising her. The room is large enough. She hesitated, then stepped inside, choosing a chair a respectful distance from his own. For a long while neither of them spoke, the silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the wind pressing against the windows. You are not what I expected, he said eventually, without looking at her. And what did you expect? Another fragile creature who would faint at the sight of mud and demand to be carried everywhere. His mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close. Instead, you ran through a storm to save a man you had known for less than a day. He needed help, Eleanor said simply. There was nothing else to consider. The Duke turned to look at her then, and something in his gaze made her breath catch, an intensity that felt far too personal for two strangers who had known each other only 3 days. My wife, he said slowly, as though testing the words, would have stayed in the carriage. Eleanor said nothing, sensing the weight behind his words, the grief he rarely allowed to surface. He seemed to catch himself a moment later, his expression closing like a door. Forgive me, he said, standing abruptly. It grows late. You should rest. She watched him leave the room, her heart aching in a way she could not fully explain, as though she had glimpsed something rare and wounded beneath his controlled exterior, something that called to the grief still living quietly in her own chest. She sat by the fire long after he had gone, staring into the flames, wondering how a man so guarded could unsettle her so completely, with nothing more than a handful of words. The following morning brought news that her carriage would require at least another week of repair, the wheelwright in the nearest village, overwhelmed with work from the storm's damage across the region. Eleanor received the news with mixed feelings, dread at the delay tangled with something she refused to name, a quiet anticipation at the thought of more evenings in that firelit library, more conversations with a man who seemed determined to keep the world at arm's length. She wrote a letter to her cousin, explaining the delay, then spent the afternoon walking the castle's east garden, where wild heather grew in defiant patches, despite the season. It was there that the Duke found her, his tall frame appearing suddenly at the garden's edge, his expression unusually open. You walk alone often, he observed, falling into step beside her without invitation. I find it clears my mind, she said. London offers little space for silence. Here, there is nothing but silence. Does it trouble you? No, she admitted. I think I needed it more than I realized. They walked together in comfortable quiet for a while, and Eleanor found herself studying him from the corner of her eye, noting the way his shoulders relaxed slightly when he believed no one was watching, the way his eyes softened when they passed a small stone bench beneath an old oak tree. My wife used to sit there, he said, noticing her gaze. She loved this garden more than any room in the castle. You do not have to speak of her if it pains you, Eleanor said gently. It does pain me, he admitted, surprising her with his honesty. But perhaps less than it once did. He glanced at her then, something unguarded crossing his features. I have not spoken her name aloud to anyone in over a year. I do not know why I feel compelled to speak of her now. To you, a stranger who arrived in the middle of a storm. Perhaps, Eleanor said carefully, because grief recognizes grief, even in strangers. He studied her for a long moment, and she felt the weight of his attention settle over her like warmth after a long cold. You lost someone as well. It was not quite a question, yet she answered it as one. My husband. A little over a year ago. Illness took him quickly, before I had time to prepare for a world without him. I am sorry, he said quietly, and she believed he meant it. They continued walking, the conversation drifting between careful truths and comfortable silences, and by the time they returned to the castle, something had shifted between them, subtle but unmistakable, a thread of understanding drawn taut between two people who had each believed themselves permanently alone in their sorrow. That night, Eleanor lay awake long after the castle had gone quiet, staring at the ceiling above her borrowed bed, her mind replaying every word the Duke had spoken in the garden. She told herself it meant nothing, that shared grief was not the same as connection, that she would leave this place within days, and likely never see Alistair Ravensmore again. Yet even as she tried to convince herself of this, she could not shake the memory of his eyes when he had looked at her beneath the old oak tree, nor the strange, unfamiliar warmth that had spread through her chest at the sound of her own name in his low, careful voice. Something had begun in that storm-battered castle, something neither of them had invited, and Eleanor feared, as she finally drifted toward sleep, that there would be no simple way to end it once it had truly started. A scream from the courtyard tore through the quiet morning, and Eleanor dropped the book she had been holding, rushing to the window in time to see a horse rearing wildly near the stable, its rider thrown hard against the cobblestones. She recognized the fallen figure instantly. It was young Colin, the stable boy who had brought her tea only an hour earlier, now lying motionless as the panicked animal thrashed dangerously close to his body. She did not stop to think. She ran from the room, down the stairs, through the great hall, and out into the courtyard, before anyone else had even reached the door. The horse reared again, hooves striking the air inches from the boy's head, and Eleanor's heart slammed against her ribs as she grabbed a length of rope hanging near the stable entrance. Move away from him, a voice thundered, and she turned to see the Duke sprinting across the courtyard, his coat forgotten, his expression fierce with alarm. He reached the horse first, seizing its bridle with both hands, using his weight and strength to force the animal's head down, until its wild motion slowed to trembling stillness. Eleanor rushed to Colin's side the moment the horse was under control, kneeling in the mud to check his breathing, relief flooding through her when she found him conscious, groaning softly, his arm bent at an unnatural angle but his eyes open and aware. You will be well, she told him firmly, pressing a hand to his shoulder to keep him from moving. Do not try to stand yet. The Duke handed the horse off to a stable hand and knelt beside her, his eyes scanning Colin's injuries with practiced calm. The arm is broken, nothing more. We were fortunate. He looked at Eleanor then, something raw and unguarded in his expression. You ran toward a panicking horse without a moment's hesitation. So did you, she pointed out, her hands still shaking from the rush of fear and relief. That is different. This is my land, my people, my responsibility. He paused, studying her more closely. You owe this boy nothing, and yet you ran first. Eleanor did not have an answer for that, not one she was willing to voice aloud, and so she simply helped steady Colin, as two servants carried him carefully toward the house to await the physician. The Duke walked beside her in silence, and when their hands brushed accidentally near the door, neither of them pulled away as quickly as propriety demanded. Word of the incident spread through the castle within hours, and by evening, even the villagers who came to deliver bread and wool had heard of the widow who ran toward danger without fear. Eleanor noticed the change immediately, the way the servants now greeted her with warmer smiles, the way the housekeeper, a stern woman named Margaret, began lingering in doorways to speak with her, rather than simply delivering messages and leaving. "You have won yourself some admirers below stairs," Margaret told her that evening, setting a tray of supper on the small table near Eleanor's window. "It is not often His Grace shows such open concern for anyone, my lady, not since." She stopped herself abruptly, pressing her lips together. "Since his wife," Eleanor finished quietly. Margaret's expression softened with something like sympathy. "You know of the late Duchess, then?" "Only that she passed, and that it changed him." Margaret hesitated, glancing toward the door as though checking for listening ears, then lowered her voice. "It was a riding accident, my lady, out on the northern cliffs. She adored fast horses and rougher trails, no matter how often His Grace begged her to take a gentler path. He was away in Edinburgh, on estate business, the day it happened. He has never forgiven himself for not being here, though there was truly nothing he could have done." Eleanor absorbed this information slowly, understanding now the particular anguish behind the Duke's reaction to the horse in the courtyard, the fierce protectiveness that had driven him to run toward danger without a second thought. Grief, she realized, did not simply live in quiet moments of sorrow. It lived in reflexes, in fears, in the small unconscious ways a person tried to prevent history from repeating itself. "Thank you for telling me," Eleanor said softly. "He does not speak of it," Margaret warned, straightening. "I would ask that you not mention I have told you." "Of course not." After Margaret left, Eleanor sat by the window for a long while, watching the last light fade over the hills, turning the new information over in her mind. She understood now why the Duke had withdrawn so completely from society, why his eyes carried such careful weariness, even in moments of warmth. He was a man who had learned that love could be taken away in an instant, without warning, without mercy, and who had built walls around himself to ensure he would never again be so thoroughly undone by loss. She recognized the pattern, because she saw it in herself as well. Since her husband's death, she had avoided close friendships, avoided suitors who called with polite intentions, avoided anything that might ask her heart to open itself again to the possibility of losing someone she loved. Meeting the Duke had begun to crack that careful armor in ways she had not anticipated, and the realization frightened her nearly as much as it comforted her. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended rhythm. Eleanor visited Colin each morning to check on his recovery, finding him in good spirits despite his splinted arm, eager to tell her stories of the castle's history and the strange legends surrounding its oldest tower. In the afternoons, she walked the grounds, sometimes alone, sometimes joined by the Duke, who seemed to find excuses to appear near whatever path she had chosen. In the evenings, they met in the library, their conversations growing longer, easier, filled with laughter that surprised them both. On the 4th evening, the Duke arrived at the library with 2 letters in hand, his expression tight with something Eleanor could not immediately identify. He set one letter down near her chair before taking his usual seat by the fire. "That arrived for you this afternoon," he said, "from London." Eleanor recognized her sister's handwriting immediately, and felt a small knot form in her stomach. She opened it carefully, scanning the familiar looping script, and felt her expression falter as she read. "Is something wrong?" the Duke asked, watching her closely. "My sister writes that Lord Pembroke has called on our family twice this month, asking after my return," Eleanor said slowly. "She believes he intends to make an offer of marriage once I am back in London." "And how do you feel about this Lord Pembroke?" Eleanor folded the letter carefully, choosing her words with care. "He is respectable, wealthy. My family believes the match would secure my future comfortably." She paused. "I feel nothing when I think of him. Not dislike, not affection, simply nothing." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the fire. "And is nothing enough for a marriage that would last the rest of your life?" "It is what many marriages are built upon," Eleanor said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Convenience, security, family expectation." "That was not the marriage you had before," he said, not quite a question. "No," she admitted softly. My husband and I loved each other deeply, from the very beginning. I did not expect to find such affection twice in one lifetime, and I do not believe I will find it with Lord Pembroke." The Duke turned to look at her then, his expression carrying a weight she could not fully interpret, something between understanding and quiet, unspoken longing. "Then perhaps," he said slowly, "you should not settle for nothing, simply because the alternative feels impossible to find again." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them seemed prepared for, and Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She wanted to ask him what he meant, whether he spoke from experience or hope, whether the careful distance he had maintained since her arrival was beginning, slowly, to dissolve. But before she could gather the courage to ask, the second letter in his hand caught her attention, his fingers tightening around it, as though he had momentarily forgotten it existed. "And your letter?" she asked instead. "You seem troubled by it." His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would refuse to answer. Then he exhaled slowly, unfolding the paper with visible reluctance. "It is from my cousin, Edmund. He writes to inform me that he intends to visit within the fortnight, supposedly to discuss estate matters." His voice hardened slightly. "Edmund has visited exactly twice in the 5 years since my wife's passing. Both times, when he believed some advantage might be gained from my grief. I do not trust his motives now, any more than I did then." "What sort of advantage could he seek?" Eleanor asked. "Edmund is my heir. Should I die without a son," the Duke said flatly. "He has made no secret of his impatience for the title, nor his belief that I have wasted these years in mourning, rather than securing an heir of my own. I imagine his visit concerns exactly that subject, dressed carefully in the language of family concern." Eleanor studied his face, noting the tension that had settled there, the careful control he exerted over words that clearly carried old, unresolved anger. "Will you receive him? I have no choice. He is family, and refusing him would only invite worse rumors than those already circulating." He glanced at her then, something almost apologetic in his expression. "I would ask that you exercise caution around him, Eleanor. Edmund has a gift for turning innocent situations into weapons, should he believe doing so serves his interests." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his low, careful voice sent a warmth through her chest that she quickly tried to suppress. "I will be careful," she promised, though privately, she wondered what interests Edmund might believe were served by targeting a widow who had arrived at the castle purely by accident. She would not have to wonder for long. The following morning brought word that Edmund's arrival had been moved forward, his carriage already approaching the castle gates nearly a week ahead of schedule. Eleanor watched from her window as a sleek black carriage rolled up the drive, and stepped out a man whose polished smile did not reach his calculating eyes, whose gaze swept over the castle's facade, with the proprietary interest of someone already imagining himself its master. She felt a chill settle over her that had nothing to do with the Highland wind, an instinct warning her that Edmund's arrival would bring complications neither she nor the Duke had fully anticipated, and that the fragile, growing warmth between them was about to be tested in ways far more dangerous than storms or wild horses ever could. Edmund Ravensmore entered the great hall with the easy confidence of a man who had rehearsed his charm in front of a mirror, his bow toward the Duke correct in every detail yet somehow carrying an undertone of mockery that Eleanor noticed immediately. His eyes found her within moments, sweeping over her plain traveling dress with open curiosity. "Alistair," he said smoothly, "you did not mention you had a guest, and such a lovely one." "Mrs. Winters suffered a carriage accident on the road below," the Duke said, his voice carefully neutral. "She has remained, while repairs are completed." "How fortunate for her," Edmund said, his smile widening in a way that made Eleanor's skin prickle with discomfort. "And how fortunate for you, cousin, to have such pleasant company during your solitary evenings." "Edmund," the Duke warned quietly. "I meant nothing by it," Edmund said, raising his hands in mock innocence, though his eyes told a different story entirely. "Merely an observation. Mrs. Winters, I hope the castle has treated you kindly, despite the circumstances of your arrival." "Very kindly," Eleanor said evenly, refusing to let his provocation unsettle her outward composure. "His Grace and his household have been generous beyond what any traveler could expect." "Generous," Edmund repeated, tasting the word, as though searching for hidden meaning within it. "Yes, I imagine he has been." The tension in the room was palpable, and Eleanor excused herself soon after, sensing that the two cousins required privacy to discuss whatever business had truly brought Edmund north. She retreated to the garden, seeking calm among the heather, but found her thoughts circling back constantly to the strange, pointed way Edmund had looked at her, as though already calculating how her presence might be used against his cousin. She did not have to wait long to understand his intentions. 2 days into his visit, Eleanor encountered Edmund alone in the east corridor, his expression shifting the moment he realized no servants were within earshot. "Mrs. Winters," he said, his tone losing its earlier warmth. "May I speak plainly?" "You may," she said cautiously. "My cousin has lived in isolation for 5 years, refusing every reasonable suggestion that he remarry and secure the succession of this title. And now, quite suddenly, a beautiful widow arrives, under circumstances no one can quite explain, and remains for far longer than any carriage repair should require." He studied her closely. "I wonder, Mrs. Winters, what exactly your intentions are." "My intentions," Eleanor said, her voice cool, despite the anger building beneath her calm exterior, "are to return to my family the moment my carriage is repaired. I have no design upon your cousin's title, nor his fortune, nor anything else you seem to be implying." "Perhaps not consciously," Edmund said, his smile returning, thinner now, sharper. "But desperation makes strange bedfellows of circumstance, Mrs. Winters, and I would advise you to consider carefully how your continued presence here might be perceived, both by society and by those who might wish to protect the Duke's interests." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Ravensmore?" "I am simply offering friendly counsel," Edmund said smoothly, "from one who understands this family far better than you ever could. Alistair is vulnerable in ways he does not recognize. A clever woman, in your position, might find that vulnerability quite useful." Eleanor held his gaze steadily, refusing to let him see how deeply his words had unsettled her. "I think you mistake me for someone with your own habits of manipulation, Mr. Ravensmore. I assure you, I have none." She walked away before he could respond further, her heart hammering with a mixture of anger and unease. That evening, she considered telling the Duke of the encounter, but hesitated, uncertain whether doing so would only inflame tensions between the cousins further, or whether Edmund's warning carried some truth she needed to consider more seriously. She found the Duke in the library as usual, though his expression that evening carried a heaviness she had not seen before. "You seem troubled," she observed, taking her seat by the fire. "Edmund has proposed, quite formally, that I consider marriage to Lady Fenwick, a young woman of considerable fortune, whose family has long sought connection to this title." His voice was flat, controlled, but Eleanor could hear the frustration simmering beneath it. "He believes securing an heir immediately would resolve what he calls the instability of my current situation." "And what do you believe?" Eleanor asked carefully. "I believe Edmund cares nothing for the stability of this family," the Duke said, his jaw tightening. "He cares only for ensuring that whoever eventually inherits owes him significant favor, having arranged the match himself. Lady Fenwick's family has already promised him considerable compensation, should the marriage proceed." Eleanor absorbed this information slowly. "He told me, this afternoon, that my presence here was inappropriate, that I ought to consider how it might be perceived." The Duke's head turned sharply toward her. "He spoke to you directly?" "He did. I did not wish to mention it, fearing it might only worsen matters between you, but I believe you should know the nature of his concerns." "Tell me exactly what he said," the Duke said, his voice low and dangerous, in a way she had not heard before. Eleanor recounted the conversation carefully, watching the Duke's expression darken with each word, his hands gripping the arms of his chair until his knuckles paled. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire with an intensity that suggested considerable internal restraint. "I apologize," he said finally, "that my cousin has subjected you to such treatment beneath my own roof." "You have nothing to apologize for," Eleanor said gently. "You did not invite his behavior." "No, but I invited him into this house, and he has repaid that welcome by insulting my guest." The Duke stood abruptly, pacing toward the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. "I should have refused his visit entirely. I knew what manner of business he intended to conduct." "Perhaps," Eleanor offered carefully, "his visit has revealed something useful, despite its unpleasantness. You now know clearly what he intends, and can prepare yourself accordingly." The Duke turned to look at her, something in his expression softening, despite the tension still evident in his shoulders. "You have a talent for finding steady ground in difficult circumstances, Eleanor. I find myself grateful for it, more than I can properly express." The use of her given name again sent warmth spreading through her chest, and she found herself unable to look away from his gaze, the firelight casting shadows across features that had grown, in the span of little more than a week, unnervingly familiar to her. "I should not enjoy your company as much as I do," she admitted quietly, surprising herself with her own honesty. "It complicates matters considerably, given how briefly I am meant to remain here." "Complicates them how?" he asked, his voice low, careful, as though treading on fragile ground. "I came to Scotland to settle my husband's affairs and find some measure of peace," she said. "I did not come here expecting to find a friendship such as this, one that unsettles me in ways I do not fully understand." "Nor did I expect it," the Duke admitted, crossing the room slowly until he stood only a few steps from her chair. "I built walls around myself quite deliberately, Eleanor, believing them necessary for my own survival. Your arrival has tested those walls more thoroughly than 5 years of careful solitude ever prepared me for." Eleanor rose from her chair, her heart pounding, aware of how close they now stood, aware of the charged silence stretching between them. "What are you saying, Alistair?" It was the first time she had used his given name, and she watched something shift behind his eyes at the sound of it, some final barrier lowering. "I am saying," he said quietly, "that I have not felt this alive in 5 years, and I do not know what to do with that realization, given everything standing between us." Before either of them could say more, the library door opened abruptly, and Edmund's voice cut through the charged silence like cold water. "Forgive the interruption," he said, though his smug expression suggested no genuine apology at all. "I merely wish to inform you both that I intend to extend my stay by another week. There is much still to discuss, cousin, regarding your future." The moment shattered instantly, the Duke stepping back with visible effort, his expression returning to its careful, controlled neutrality. Eleanor excused herself quickly, her heart still racing, as she retreated to her room, replaying every word the Duke had spoken, wondering with a mixture of hope and dread what might have happened had Edmund not interrupted them, and fearing, quite suddenly, that Edmund's extended stay would bring dangers far greater than mere gossip and disapproval. Smoke curled from the stable roof before dawn, and the shout that woke the castle sent Eleanor bolting upright in bed, her heart slamming against her ribs as she recognized the smell drifting through her window. She threw a shawl over her nightdress and ran barefoot down the stairs, joining the chaos of servants rushing toward the courtyard with buckets and blankets. The stable stood partially engulfed, orange light flickering against the dark sky, horses screaming in terror as stable hands fought to lead them out through the smoke-filled doors. Eleanor spotted the Duke immediately, his shirt already soaked with sweat and soot, hauling open the door of a stall, where a young mare reared in blind panic. "Get back," he shouted at the gathering servants. "Form a line to the well, now." Eleanor did not hesitate. She grabbed an empty bucket from a stunned kitchen girl and joined the line forming toward the water, passing bucket after bucket toward the flames, her arms burning with exertion, her eyes stinging from smoke that rolled thick across the courtyard. She watched the Duke disappear into the smoke twice more, each time emerging with another terrified animal, his face streaked black, his hands raw from gripping hot leather and rope. It took nearly an hour to bring the fire fully under control. The stable roof partially collapsed, but the horses, remarkably, all accounted for, and safe in the adjoining paddock. Eleanor sat exhausted on an overturned trough afterward, her hands blistered from the rough bucket handles, watching the Duke direct the final efforts to douse the smoldering embers. When at last the danger had passed, he approached her, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and something rawer beneath it. Fear, only now permitted to surface, now that the crisis had ended. "You should not have been out here," he said, kneeling in front of her, taking her blistered hands gently into his own to examine the damage. "You could have been hurt." "So could you," she said, watching him carefully. "You ran into a burning building 3 times. That is different. I know this land, these animals. You had no reason to risk yourself." "I told you before," Eleanor said softly. "I am not the sort of woman who stands by while others are in danger." His thumb traced gently over the reddened skin of her palm, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the intimacy of the gesture heavier than either seemed prepared to acknowledge in the gray light of dawn. "How did the fire start?" she asked eventually, breaking the charged silence. "I do not know yet," he said, his jaw tightening. "The stable boy who sleeps near the tack room swears he extinguished every lantern before retiring. I intend to investigate further once we have rested." Later that morning, after the household had washed away the worst of the smoke and exhaustion, the Duke summoned the stable staff for careful questioning. Eleanor sat quietly in the corner of the study, watching as each servant recounted their movements the previous evening, until finally, the stable boy, a nervous young man named Ewan, admitted with visible fear that he had seen Edmund near the stable well after midnight, though he had assumed at the time that his master's cousin simply could not sleep. "You are certain it was him?" the Duke pressed, his voice dangerously quiet. "Aye, Your Grace. I recognized his coat clear enough in the moonlight. He was near the hay store, not the stalls, but I thought nothing of it at the time." The Duke dismissed the boy and sat in heavy silence for a long moment after he left, his hands pressed flat against the desk. "The hay store," he said finally, "shares a wall with the lantern room. If a lantern were left burning too close to dry hay, deliberately or otherwise, the fire that followed would appear entirely accidental." "You believe Edmund set the fire deliberately?" Eleanor asked, horror creeping into her voice. "I do not yet have proof," the Duke said carefully, though his tone suggested he already believed it entirely. "But I know my cousin, Eleanor. He is patient, and he is willing to create chaos if he believes it serves his purposes. A fire that damaged my stables and threatened my household would certainly demonstrate, quite conveniently, the instability of a house without a proper mistress to manage it." "That is monstrous," Eleanor said, appalled. "He would risk lives, risk this entire estate, simply to further his own ambitions? You do not yet understand how deeply ambition can corrupt a man who has spent his entire life believing himself entitled to more than he has been given," the Duke said grimly. "I will confront him, but carefully. Without proof, accusations alone would only provide him grounds to claim persecution, and further poison whatever remains of our family's already fragile reputation." That evening, the confrontation came regardless, Edmund appearing at supper with his usual polished smile, seemingly unbothered by the morning's chaos. "Terrible business with the stable," he remarked lightly, cutting into his food with casual precision. "I am relieved no one was seriously harmed." "Where were you last night, Edmund?" the Duke asked directly, his voice carrying an edge that silenced the room instantly. Edmund's fork paused for the briefest moment before continuing its motion. "In my room, of course, cousin. Where else would I have been at such an hour?" "Ewan saw you near the hay store shortly after midnight." "Ewan," Edmund repeated smoothly, "is a nervous boy prone to exaggeration, as I understand it. I stepped outside briefly for air, finding my chambers rather stuffy. I certainly did not linger near any hay store, nor would I have any reason to." The Duke's eyes narrowed, but without concrete proof beyond a servant's uncertain testimony, there was little more he could press. "See that you do not wander the grounds unaccompanied for the remainder of your stay," he said finally, his voice cold. "Given the circumstances, I would prefer to know precisely where every occupant of this house is located at all times." "Of course, cousin," Edmund said, his smile never wavering, though his eyes carried a warning as they flicked briefly toward Eleanor. "Whatever puts your mind at ease." The dinner concluded in strained silence, and Eleanor excused herself early, unsettled by the entire exchange, by Edmund's cold composure, and the clear message contained within his glance toward her. She retreated to her room, locking the door carefully, a habit she had not previously felt necessary within these walls. Sleep proved elusive. Around midnight, a soft knock startled her from restless half-dreaming, and she opened the door cautiously, to find the Duke standing in the corridor, a single candle in hand, his expression troubled. "Forgive the late hour," he said quietly. "I wish to ensure you are well, given everything that has occurred." "I am well," she said, stepping back to allow him entry, though propriety screamed against the decision even as she made it. "Though I confess, Edmund's manner at supper left me uneasy." "He means to frighten you into leaving," the Duke said, moving to stand near her window, staring out at the moonlit hills. "If you depart the castle believing yourself unwelcome or unsafe, he removes what he perceives as a complication to his plans. without ever needing to prove anything against you directly. Do you wish me to leave? Eleanor asked quietly, bracing herself for an answer she feared to hear. The Duke turned to face her, closing the distance between them, with slow, deliberate steps. No, he said, his voice rough, with an honesty that made her breath catch. I have not wished for anyone's company in 5 years, the way I wish for yours, Eleanor. The thought of you leaving because of Edmund's cruelty fills me with something close to fury. They stood close now, closer than propriety allowed, the candlelight flickering shadows across features that had grown, over these past days, so painfully dear to her. Alistair, she whispered, uncertain whether she meant to warn him or invite him closer. I know, he said softly, understanding the weight behind her single word. I know precisely what we risk, and precisely what remains impossible between us, given everything Edmund threatens, and everything society expects. His hand rose, hovering near her cheek without quite touching, as though he feared what contact might unleash. And yet I find myself standing here regardless, unable to convince myself to walk away. Neither can I, Eleanor admitted, her voice barely audible. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved, the air between them charged with everything unspoken, everything forbidden, everything they both understood could not simply be wished away by feeling alone. Then, with visible effort, the Duke stepped back, his hand falling to his side, his expression carrying equal measures of relief and regret. Lock your door after I leave, he said quietly, and trust nothing Edmund tells you, whatever manner of persuasion he attempts. He left before she could respond, and Eleanor stood alone, in the dim candlelight for a long while afterward, her heart pounding, aware that whatever careful distance had once existed between herself and the Duke of Ravensmoor had, in the span of a single charged moment, become nearly impossible to maintain. Word arrived 3 days later that Eleanor's carriage had finally been repaired, the wheelwright's letter delivered by a boy from the village, along with a small bundle of correspondence that had accumulated during her stay. Eleanor read the news with a strange hollow feeling settling in her chest, relief and dread tangled together in equal measure. She would need to depart within days, her reasons for remaining at the castle now entirely exhausted. She found the Duke in his study, reviewing estate ledgers, Edmund thankfully absent on some errand of his own devising. When she informed him of the carriage's repair, he set down his pen slowly, his expression carefully composed, in a way that told her he was working hard to conceal his true reaction. That is good news, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Your family will be relieved to have you home safely. Yes, Eleanor agreed, equally unconvincing. They stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken weight of their previous encounter still hovering between them, neither quite willing to address it directly in the daylight hours, surrounded by ledgers and duty, and the careful formality that governed their positions. Would you walk with me? The Duke asked eventually. Before you must begin preparations for departure, there is a glen, beyond the eastern ridge, I have wished to show you, though I have found no proper occasion until now. Eleanor agreed readily, grateful for any excuse to delay the practical business of packing and farewells that awaited her. They set out an hour later, the autumn air crisp against her cheeks, the hills around them painted in shades of gold and rust that seemed almost too beautiful for the heaviness settling in her heart. The glen, when they reached it, took her breath away entirely. A narrow valley cut between two rising ridges, a small stream winding through wildflowers that had somehow survived the season's turn, mist curling low along the ground, despite the clear sky above. The Duke led her toward a flat outcropping of stone, overlooking the entire valley, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the light shift across the landscape below. My wife discovered this place, he said eventually, breaking the quiet. Early in our marriage. She used to ride out here whenever she needed solitude, and eventually she brought me along, insisting I would understand her love for it once I saw it myself. He paused, his expression distant. She was right, of course. I have not brought anyone else here since her passing. Eleanor understood the significance of the gesture immediately, the weight of trust contained within his choice to share this particular place with her. Thank you, she said softly, for showing me somewhere so important to you. I find myself wanting to share things with you that I believed I would never share with anyone again, he admitted, turning to look at her directly. It frightens me, Eleanor, how quickly you have become someone I cannot imagine simply forgetting, once you return to London. I feel the same fear, she confessed. I came to Scotland believing I would find only peace and solitude, a place to grieve quietly, before returning to a life I had already resigned myself to living without joy. Instead, I found you, and now I do not know how to return to that resignation. Then do not return to it, he said, his voice low and urgent. Stay, Eleanor. Not as a guest requiring repair to her carriage, but as someone I wish to know fully, without the constraints of propriety and circumstance dictating every careful distance between us. Alistair, she said, her heart aching with the impossibility of what he offered, you know I cannot simply stay. My family expects my return. Society would speak of nothing else, should I remain here unmarried and unchaperoned in a duke's household indefinitely. And Edmund would use such a decision as proof of exactly the scandal he seeks to create. I know, he said, frustration evident in his voice. I know precisely how impossible this is, and yet I find myself unable to simply let you leave without saying what I feel, regardless of how foolish or reckless it may be to speak it. Then speak it, Eleanor said softly, bracing herself. He turned to face her fully, his eyes carrying an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. I have loved once in my life, deeply and completely, and I believed when I lost that love, I would never again feel anything close to it. You have proven me wrong, Eleanor Winters, in the span of barely 2 weeks, and I do not know what to do with a truth so inconvenient and so undeniable. Tears gathered unexpectedly in Eleanor's eyes, and she found herself unable to speak for a long moment, overwhelmed by the honesty of his confession and the corresponding truth rising within her own chest. I loved my husband deeply as well, she said finally, her voice trembling. I believed the same thing you did, that such love was a singular gift, never to be repeated. And yet here I am, feeling something for you that frightens me, precisely because of how completely undeniable it has become. They sat together in charged silence after that, neither quite willing to close the remaining distance between them, both acutely aware of everything standing in their way, yet neither able to summon the will to simply walk away from what had grown between them. The mist curled lower in the valley below as the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, and eventually, reluctantly, they rose to make their way back toward the castle, the conversation unfinished, the tension between them unresolved but undeniably, irrevocably present. They had nearly reached the castle gates when a rider approached at speed from the village road, dismounting hurriedly to deliver an urgent message to the Duke. He read the letter quickly, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm within seconds. What is it? Eleanor asked, alarmed by the sudden tension in his posture. It is from my solicitor in Edinburgh, the Duke said grimly. He writes that Edmund has been making inquiries regarding my late wife's death, questioning witnesses who were present that day, suggesting there may be grounds to investigate the circumstances further. His jaw tightened. I believe he intends to suggest, quite publicly if necessary, that I bear some responsibility for her death that has gone unaddressed, using such an accusation to further discredit my judgment and hasten calls for my removal from proper management of this estate. Would anyone believe such a claim? Eleanor asked, horrified. Enough might, if presented convincingly, the Duke said. Grief alone has already made me an object of suspicion in certain circles. Edmund understands precisely how to exploit doubt, even where no true wrongdoing exists. He folded the letter carefully, his expression hardening with resolve. I must return to the house and address this immediately, before rumor spreads further than it already has. They walked the remaining distance in tense silence, Eleanor's mind racing with concern for the man beside her, understanding now with painful clarity exactly how dangerous Edmund's ambitions had become, and fearing, as they approached the castle's shadow, that whatever fragile happiness had bloomed between them in the glen that afternoon might soon be tested far more severely than either of them could yet anticipate. The great hall erupted into raised voices the moment the Duke confronted Edmund with the solicitor's letter, and Eleanor stood frozen near the doorway, watching the two cousins face each other with open hostility for the first time since her arrival. You dare question witnesses about my wife's death, the Duke said, his voice deadly quiet in a way that carried more menace than any shout could have managed, and spread suggestions of wrongdoing, where none exists. I am merely ensuring proper diligence has been observed, Edmund said. though his composure had begun to crack under the weight of the Duke's fury. "Surely you cannot object to a thorough accounting of events, cousin, unless you have something to hide." "You know precisely what happened that day," the Duke said, advancing a step closer. "I was in Edinburgh, 40 miles distant, meeting with tenant representatives at your own family's request, Edmund. You cannot manufacture suspicion from a tragedy simply because it serves your ambitions." "My ambitions," Edmund repeated, his mask finally slipping entirely, revealing something colder and more desperate beneath. "Do you know what it is to watch a title and fortune you were raised to expect slip further from your grasp each year, cousin, while you squander your position, wallowing in grief that serves no one? I have waited 5 years for you to remarry, to secure the succession properly, to fulfill the responsibilities this family requires. Instead, you isolate yourself in this crumbling castle, entertaining widows who wander in from storms, while the estate's true future remains entirely unaddressed." "You will leave this house tomorrow morning," the Duke said, his voice carrying absolute finality, "and you will cease immediately any further inquiries regarding my late wife, or I will ensure every solicitor in Edinburgh understands precisely the nature of your recent conduct, including the stable fire that nearly claimed lives beneath this roof." Edmund's face paled slightly at the mention of the fire, confirming, at least to Eleanor's satisfaction, exactly what she and the Duke had already suspected. "You have no proof of any such thing," he said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "I have enough suspicion to make your remaining time in polite society considerably more difficult, should you continue testing my patience," the Duke said coldly. "Leave, Edmund, before I decide that suspicion alone is sufficient grounds for far harsher action." Edmund departed the following morning as instructed, his carriage rolling away from the castle gates without ceremony or farewell, and the household seemed to exhale collectively once the sound of his wheels had finally faded into silence. Eleanor found the Duke standing near the same window where she had first encountered him, weeks earlier, soaked and desperate in the aftermath of the storm. "He is truly gone?" she asked, joining him near the glass. "For now," the Duke said, though weariness colored his voice. "Edmund does not surrender easily, but he understands, at least temporarily, that further scheming here carries genuine risk to his own reputation." "I am sorry. You must contend with such a man as family," Eleanor said gently. "I am simply grateful this particular confrontation has ended, without greater damage." He turned to look at her then, something shifting in his expression, the careful control he had maintained throughout the day's tension finally beginning to soften. "You have been remarkably steady through all of this, Eleanor. I do not think I properly thanked you for your patience and support." "You do not need to thank me," she said softly. "I would not have wished to be anywhere else." That evening, the household celebrated Edmund's departure with a quiet, informal supper, the atmosphere lighter than it had been in days. Afterward, unable to settle into sleep despite her exhaustion, Eleanor wandered out into the garden, beneath a sky brilliant with stars, the autumn air cool and clean after days of tension finally released. She found the Duke already there, standing near the old stone bench beneath the oak tree, where his late wife had once spent so many quiet hours. He turned as she approached, moonlight silvering his features, and something in his expression told her he had been waiting, perhaps hoping, that she might find her way to this particular spot. "I could not sleep," she admitted, coming to stand beside him. "Neither could I," he said. "Too much has happened today to simply close one's eyes and expect rest to follow easily." They stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching moonlight play across the garden's wild heather, the weight of everything unspoken between them growing heavier with each passing second. Eleanor knew, with painful clarity, that her carriage awaited repair completion, that she would need to depart within days, that whatever existed between herself and this careful, wounded man could not simply continue indefinitely, without consequence to them both. "I leave in 3 days," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "I know," he said, his voice rough. "I do not know how to say goodbye to you, Alistair," she admitted, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes. "These past weeks have changed something in me I did not believe could be changed again, and the thought of returning to London, to a life without this, without you, feels almost unbearable." He turned to face her fully, his hand rising slowly to brush a tear from her cheek, the gentleness of the gesture nearly undoing her entirely. "Then do not think of goodbye tonight," he said softly. "Think only of this moment, Eleanor, and allow me, just once, to show you what I feel, before circumstance forces us apart." She did not pull away as his hand cupped her face more fully, did not step back as he closed the remaining distance between them, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and longing that overwhelmed every careful argument her mind attempted to raise. When his lips finally met hers, gentle at first, then deepening with the weight of weeks of unspoken longing, Eleanor felt something within her that had remained frozen since her husband's passing finally begin, tentatively, to thaw. The embrace lasted only a moment, brief against the vastness of the night sky above them, yet it carried a significance neither of them could deny, a single instant that seemed to alter the very foundation of who they had believed themselves to be. When they finally parted, both breathing unsteadily, the Duke pressed his forehead gently against hers, his eyes closed, his expression carrying equal measures of joy and anguish. "Forgive me," he whispered. "I should not have." "Do not apologize," Eleanor said softly, though her own mind was already beginning to spin with the weight of what had just occurred, with the impossibility of what they had allowed themselves, just once, to feel fully. "Please, Alistair, do not apologize for this." Yet even as she spoke the words, she felt the familiar cold creep of guilt beginning to settle over her heart, memories of her husband rising unbidden, questions of propriety and reputation crowding urgently into thoughts that only moments earlier had contained nothing but pure, unguarded feeling. She stepped back slowly, her hand still trembling where it had rested against his chest, and saw in his eyes the same conflicted recognition that had begun to surface within her own conscience. "I should return inside," she said quietly, her voice unsteady. "Eleanor," he began, reaching for her hand. "Please," she said, already turning away, tears threatening once more. "I need time to understand what this means, Alistair, for both of us." She left him standing alone, beneath the old oak tree, moonlight casting long shadows across the garden, and hurried back toward the castle, her heart torn violently between the overwhelming joy of what she had just experienced and the crushing weight of guilt and uncertainty that followed close behind it, refusing to be silenced, refusing to allow her even a single night of untroubled peace. Morning arrived gray and quiet, and Eleanor woke with her eyes swollen from a night spent alternating between restless sleep and wakeful guilt, replaying the embrace beneath the oak tree, over and over, until she could no longer separate the memory of joy from the weight of shame that had followed it. She rose before the household had fully stirred, and began, with trembling hands, to pack the few belongings she had accumulated during her extended stay. A soft knock interrupted her preparations, and she opened the door to find Margaret standing with a tray of tea, her expression carrying quiet concern. "You look as though you have not slept, my lady," Margaret observed gently. "I have much on my mind," Eleanor said, unable to offer further explanation. "The carriage repairs will be finished within 2 days," Margaret said, setting the tray down carefully. "Word arrived from the village early this morning." She paused, studying Eleanor's face with the careful attention of someone who suspected more than she dared, voice aloud. "Will you be departing then, my lady?" "Yes," Eleanor said, her voice firmer than she felt. "I believe it is time." Margaret nodded slowly, though something in her expression suggested she understood there was more beneath the simple statement than Eleanor was willing to share. "His Grace will be sorry to see you go," she said quietly, before excusing herself from the room. Eleanor spent the following 2 days in careful, deliberate avoidance of the Duke, taking her meals earlier than usual, walking the grounds only when she knew he was occupied with estate business, retreating to her room each evening, long before the hour they typically met in the library. She told herself this distance was necessary, that clarity required space from the very source of her confusion, yet each empty evening left her feeling hollow in ways she had not anticipated. On the 3rd morning, her carriage finally repaired, and waiting in the courtyard, Eleanor descended the castle stairs with her trunk already loaded, prepared to depart without the confrontation she had spent days carefully avoiding. She found the Duke waiting near the entrance instead, his expression carefully composed, though the tightness around his eyes betrayed the effort such composure required. "You intended to leave without speaking with me," he observed quietly. "I did not know what to say," Eleanor admitted, unable to meet his gaze fully. "Do you regret it?" he asked directly. "What happened between us in the garden?" Eleanor hesitated, torn between honesty and self-protection. "I do not regret the feeling," she said carefully. "But I regret the position it has placed us both in. Alistair, I am recently widowed. You are a duke whose reputation has already suffered years of unfair scrutiny. Whatever we felt beneath that oak tree, it changes nothing about the impossibility of our circumstances." "Does it truly change nothing?" he asked, his voice carrying quiet intensity. "Or does it change everything, and you simply find that truth too frightening to accept?" "Perhaps both," Eleanor said softly, tears gathering despite her efforts to remain composed. "I cannot build a future upon a single moment of weakness, however deeply felt. My family expects my return. Society would speak of nothing else, should word of our closeness ever spread beyond these walls. And I do not know, honestly, whether what I feel for you is genuine affection, or simply the desperate comfort of shared grief, mistaken for something deeper than it truly is." The Duke's expression shuddered slightly at her words, though he did not argue further. "Then, perhaps distance will provide the clarity you seek," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I will not stand in the way of your departure, Eleanor, nor attempt to persuade you toward a decision you are not prepared to make." "Thank you for understanding," she whispered, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. He walked her to the carriage himself, his manner formal, distant, every trace of the warmth that had grown between them over the preceding weeks, carefully concealed behind careful courtesy. As the servants finished loading her final belongings, he took her hand briefly to help her into the carriage, and for just a moment, his composure cracked entirely. "Whatever you decide, Eleanor," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion he could no longer fully suppress. "Know that these weeks have meant more to me than I believed possible, given everything I had convinced myself I would never feel again." "They have meant the same to me," she managed, her voice breaking slightly. He stepped back then, releasing her hand, and the carriage door closed between them, with a finality that felt far heavier than mere wood and iron. As the carriage began its slow journey down the winding drive, Eleanor turned to watch the castle grow smaller behind her, the Duke's tall figure remaining motionless near the entrance, until the final bend in the road stole him entirely from view. The journey south passed in a blur of tears, carefully hidden from her traveling companions, questions circling endlessly through her mind, without resolution. She told herself repeatedly that she had made the correct decision, that distance would restore clarity, that whatever she had felt within those castle walls belonged properly to a strange, isolated interlude, rather than genuine, lasting affection. Yet even as she repeated these reassurances, she found herself remembering the particular way the Duke's eyes had softened when he spoke of grief, the steady strength of his hands as he calmed a panicked horse, the raw honesty of his confession beneath the ancient oak tree, and she wondered, with growing unease, whether she had simply run from the very thing she needed most, mistaking fear for wisdom. By the time her carriage reached the outskirts of London 3 days later, Eleanor had convinced herself of nothing except the certainty that her heart remained thoroughly unsettled, torn between the safety of familiar expectation and the frightening, undeniable pull of something entirely new. Her sister greeted her arrival with obvious relief and immediate questions about her extended absence. Questions Eleanor found herself answering with careful, incomplete truths, unable yet to voice aloud the full weight of what had transpired during her time in the Highlands. That night, alone in her familiar London bedroom, surrounded by possessions and routines that had once felt entirely her own, Eleanor found herself staring at the ceiling in much the same manner she had during her final restless night at the castle, the memory of moonlight and oak leaves and a single, transformative embrace refusing to release its hold upon her thoughts, no matter how firmly she insisted to herself that distance had already begun its promised work of clarity and healing. It had not. If anything, the distance had only revealed, with painful clarity, precisely how deeply Duke Alistair Ravensmore had already embedded himself within her heart, and Eleanor feared, as sleep finally claimed her exhausted mind, that no amount of proper distance or careful reasoning would ever fully undo what a single storm-battered arrival in the Scottish Highlands had already, irrevocably, set into motion. 3 weeks into her return to London, Eleanor found herself seated in her family's drawing room, forcing polite smiles as Lord Pembroke discussed the weather with the practiced ease of a man entirely confident in the eventual success of his courtship. Her sister Charlotte sat nearby, glancing between them with poorly concealed hope, while their mother poured tea with an efficiency that suggested she had already begun planning wedding arrangements in her mind. "You seem distracted this afternoon, Mrs. Winters," Lord Pembroke observed, his tone kind, despite the mild reproach in his words. "Forgive me," Eleanor said, forcing her attention back to the present moment. "I find myself still somewhat fatigued from my travels." "Scotland must have been quite an ordeal," Lord Pembroke said, though his tone suggested polite disinterest, rather than genuine curiosity. "I confess I have never understood the appeal of such rugged, isolated country." Eleanor thought immediately of misted glens and heather-covered hills, of firelit libraries and moonlit gardens, and found herself unable to summon any words that might properly explain to this comfortable, predictable man exactly what she had discovered within that rugged isolation. "It had its own particular beauty," she said simply, "though I understand it is not to everyone's taste." After Lord Pembroke departed, Charlotte turned to her with barely contained impatience. "Eleanor, he has called on us 4 times this month alone. Surely you understand what such attention signifies." "I understand perfectly well," Eleanor said, more sharply than she intended. "Then why do you continue to discourage him so thoroughly? He is respectable, wealthy, and clearly devoted to securing your hand. Mother believes an offer is imminent, and I confess I do not understand your hesitation." Eleanor set down her teacup carefully, choosing her words with deliberate caution. "I do not love him, Charlotte. I feel nothing when he speaks. Nothing when he takes my hand in greeting. I cannot commit myself to a lifetime beside a man who inspires such complete indifference within me." "Love is not always necessary for a successful marriage," Charlotte said gently, though her expression carried genuine concern. "You loved once, deeply, and lost that love to illness. Perhaps expecting to find such feeling twice in one lifetime is simply unrealistic." The words struck closer to truth than Charlotte likely realized, echoing almost exactly the reasoning Eleanor herself had once used to justify her growing distance from anything resembling genuine affection. Yet now, having spent weeks in the company of a man who had reawakened feelings she believed permanently extinguished, she found herself unable to accept her sister's reasoning quite so readily as she once might have. "Perhaps you are right," Eleanor said carefully, unwilling yet to reveal the true source of her hesitation. "I simply require more time before making such a permanent decision." Charlotte studied her closely, something suspicious entering her expression. "Eleanor, did something occur during your time in Scotland that you have not yet shared with me?" "Nothing worth discussing," Eleanor said quickly, perhaps too quickly, for Charlotte's expression only sharpened further with curiosity she chose, mercifully, not to pursue further that particular afternoon. Meanwhile, far to the north, Alistair Ravensmore faced troubles of his own, considerably more urgent than romantic uncertainty. Edmund, despite his forced departure from the castle, had not abandoned his campaign against his cousin's reputation and financial standing. Letters began arriving at the castle with troubling regularity. Official notices from creditors questioning the estate's outstanding obligations, inquiries from distant relatives suddenly curious about the succession, and finally, most alarmingly, a formal notice from the Crown's representatives regarding an inquiry into the management of certain estate lands that bordered property Edmund's mother's family had long disputed. "He has friends in positions of influence," the Duke's solicitor explained during an urgent meeting in the castle's study, "and he has clearly spent considerable effort convincing them that your management of this estate warrants formal review. The timing, immediately following his departure, suggests deliberate retaliation for his removal from these premises." "What does such a review entail?" the Duke asked, his expression grim. "Officials will examine the estate's finances, its tenant agreements, and its overall management practices over the past 5 years," the solicitor explained carefully. "Should they find any irregularities, even minor ones, stemming from your understandably diminished attention during your period of grief, Edmund could use such findings to argue you are unfit to properly manage the succession, potentially strengthening his own claim should circumstances ever require a transfer of authority." The Duke absorbed this information with visible frustration, understanding immediately the danger such a review posed, not merely to his finances, but to the very foundation of his family's legacy. "Then we must ensure the estate's records are in perfect order before any officials arrive," he said finally. I will not give Edmund the satisfaction of finding a single irregularity to exploit. The following weeks passed in exhausting labor, the Duke working alongside his solicitor and estate manager, late into each evening, reviewing tenant agreements, correcting minor administrative oversights, and preparing meticulously for whatever scrutiny Edmund's scheme might bring. Throughout this demanding period, his thoughts returned constantly, despite his efforts to remain focused entirely on estate matters, to the widow who had departed his castle weeks earlier, her final words of uncertainty and doubt echoing through his quieter moments with painful persistence. He had received no correspondence from Eleanor since her departure, and he told himself repeatedly that her silence confirmed exactly what he had feared. That distance had indeed restored her sense of proper caution, that whatever had bloomed between them beneath the ancient oak tree had been, for her, merely a passing weakness born of shared grief rather than lasting affection. Yet even as he told himself this, he found himself unable to fully accept the conclusion, unable to forget the particular way her eyes had softened when she spoke of her own losses, the fierce courage she had shown running toward burning stables and panicked horses without a moment's hesitation. Nearly 2 months after her departure, as the Duke prepared his estate's records for the impending official review, a letter arrived that changed the trajectory of everything that followed. It came not from Eleanor herself, but from her sister Charlotte, whose name he recognized only vaguely, from Eleanor's occasional mention during their weeks together. The letter was brief, almost apologetic in tone, yet its contents struck him with considerable force. Charlotte wrote that her sister had grown increasingly withdrawn since returning from Scotland, refusing all serious suitors despite mounting family pressure, spending long hours in solitary silence that concerned her family greatly. She had discovered, quite by accident, correspondence Eleanor had begun and abandoned repeatedly, letters addressed to the Duke of Ravensmore that were never actually sent. Filled with sentiments, Charlotte felt compelled, out of sisterly concern, to bring to his attention, believing perhaps that only he might understand the true source of her sister's evident unhappiness. The Duke read the letter 3 times before setting it down with hands that trembled slightly, hope and determination rising within him in equal measure. Whatever fear had driven Eleanor's careful retreat during their final conversation at the castle gates, her sister's letter suggested clearly that distance had done nothing to diminish what had grown between them, and that perhaps, despite every obstacle still standing in their path, the possibility of a genuine future together remained very much alive, waiting only for the courage of one or both of them to reach for it properly. The Duke's carriage rattled through London's crowded streets on a grey afternoon. 3 days after Charlotte's letter had arrived, his estate's official review now safely completed, with no irregularities found, Edmund's scheme thoroughly defeated by careful preparation and meticulous record-keeping. Yet despite this considerable victory, Alistair found his thoughts consumed entirely by a far more personal matter, one that had driven him south with an urgency he had not felt in years. He arrived at Eleanor's family residence without formal warning, understanding that propriety demanded advance notice, yet unwilling to risk any delay that might allow doubt or family interference to complicate his purpose. The butler who answered his knock seemed startled by the unexpected arrival of a duke, and hurried immediately to announce his presence to the household. Eleanor's mother appeared first, flustered, and clearly overwhelmed by the significance of receiving such an unexpected, distinguished visitor. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying deeply. "We had no notice of your visit. Please, come in immediately." "Forgive my lack of proper warning," the Duke said, his tone carefully polite, despite the urgency he felt. "I have traveled from Scotland specifically to speak with your daughter, Mrs. Winters, regarding a matter of considerable importance." Eleanor's mother's eyes widened with obvious speculation, though she said nothing further, leading him instead into the drawing room, where Charlotte sat, with barely concealed excitement, clearly having anticipated exactly this outcome from her carefully composed letter. "I will fetch my sister immediately, Your Grace," Charlotte said, rising quickly. Eleanor descended the stairs moments later, her expression shifting from confusion to shock, to something far more complicated, the moment she recognized the tall figure waiting in her family's drawing room. "Alistair," she breathed, momentarily forgetting all formality in her astonishment. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying the same careful warmth she remembered from countless evenings beside his library fire. Forgive my unannounced arrival. I understand it is highly improper, but I found myself unable to wait any longer for proper introduction. Eleanor's mother and sister exchanged meaningful glances before Charlotte, with obvious diplomatic intent, suggested they might allow the Duke and her sister a few moments of private conversation, citing some urgent household matter that required her mother's immediate attention elsewhere. Once they had departed, leaving the drawing room door only partially closed for propriety's sake, Eleanor turned to face the Duke fully, her heart pounding with a mixture of joy and lingering uncertainty. "Why have you come?" she asked, though something in her expression suggested she already suspected, and perhaps hoped for, the answer. "Your sister wrote to me," he admitted, "informing me of letters you began, but never sent, of an unhappiness she believed stemmed from more than simple exhaustion, following our time together in Scotland." He crossed the room slowly, stopping a respectful distance from where she stood, though the intensity of his gaze closed whatever physical distance remained between them entirely. "I have spent 2 months attempting to convince myself that your final words at my castle gates represented genuine wisdom, that distance would restore whatever clarity you sought regarding your own feelings. I have failed entirely at this attempt, Eleanor, and I have come to ask, quite directly, whether you have found the clarity you were seeking, and if so, what that clarity has revealed." Eleanor felt tears gathering unexpectedly, overwhelmed by the directness of his question and the courage it had required to travel such distance for an answer he could not have guaranteed. "I have found clarity," she said softly, "though perhaps not the clarity I originally sought." She took a steadying breath. "I convinced myself, during our final conversation, that what I felt for you might simply be the desperate comfort of shared grief, mistaken for something deeper. These past 2 months have proven that reasoning entirely false. I have grown no less certain of my feelings with distance, Alistair. If anything, I have grown considerably more certain and considerably more miserable for having denied them." Relief and joy flooded across the Duke's careful features, and he closed the final distance between them, taking her hands gently within his own. "Then let us not waste further time on caution and distance," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I understand fully everything that stands against us, Eleanor. The scrutiny of society, the complications of my title and estate, the natural hesitation any widow might feel toward a second commitment of the heart. But I have lived 5 years believing myself permanently closed to such feeling, and I refuse now to let fear rob either of us of a genuine chance at happiness, simply because circumstance makes that happiness inconvenient." "What are you asking of me, Alistair?" Eleanor asked, though her racing heart already anticipated his answer. "I am asking you to consider a future beside me," he said simply. "Not as a temporary guest sheltering from a storm, but as my wife, properly and permanently, should you find yourself willing to accept both my heart and everything complicated that comes attached to it." Eleanor's breath caught entirely, and for a long moment she simply stared at him, overwhelmed by the enormity of what he offered, by the courage it had required for him to travel such distance and risk such vulnerability for an answer he could not have guaranteed. "You understand," she said carefully, "that my family will have questions, that society will speculate endlessly regarding the speed and circumstances of such a match." "I understand entirely," he said, "and I care considerably less about society's speculation than I care about your answer to my question." Eleanor felt the last of her careful hesitation dissolving entirely, replaced by a certainty she had denied herself for weeks, out of fear rather than genuine doubt. "Then my answer," she said, her voice steady, despite tears now falling freely, "is yes, Alistair. I will marry you, and I will do so gladly, whatever complications society or circumstance may yet present." The joy that broke across his features in that moment rivaled anything Eleanor had witnessed during their weeks together in Scotland, and when he drew her gently into an embrace, careful of propriety, yet unable to fully restrain the depth of his relief and happiness, Eleanor felt, for the first time since her husband's passing, a sense of genuine hope for a future she had believed permanently closed to her. They would face challenges ahead, certainly. Edmund's schemes, though currently defeated, might yet resurface in new forms. Society would speculate endlessly regarding the speed of their courtship. Eleanor's family would require careful, patient explanation regarding a decision that would undoubtedly surprise them considerably. Yet standing within the circle of Alastair's arms, in her family's modest London drawing room, Eleanor felt none of these future complications diminish the profound rightness of the decision she had just made, understanding finally, with complete certainty, that some connections were simply too significant, too transformative, to abandon out of fear or convention. Word of the engagement spread through London society within days, exactly as Eleanor had anticipated, drawing rooms across the city buzzing with speculation regarding the sudden, unexpected match between a reclusive Scottish duke and a young widow whose family, until recently, had seemed destined to see her comfortably settled with the far more predictable Lord Pembroke. Eleanor bore the resulting scrutiny with steady composure, understanding that whatever gossip circulated would eventually fade, replaced inevitably by society's next fascination. Her mother, initially startled by the suddenness of the announcement, grew gradually more accepting once she understood the genuine depth of affection between her daughter and the Duke, particularly after witnessing firsthand the careful, attentive manner in which Alastair treated Eleanor during his extended stay in London, while wedding arrangements were finalized. Charlotte, delighted by the role her letter had played in bringing the couple together, took considerable pride in claiming at least partial credit for their eventual happiness, a claim Eleanor found herself unable to dispute, given how directly her sister's intervention had prompted Alastair's journey south. Lord Pembroke, upon learning of the engagement, called once more to offer his formal congratulations, his manner gracious, despite what must have been considerable disappointment at losing a match his family had clearly anticipated. "I confess I am surprised," he told Eleanor privately during his brief visit, "though perhaps I should not be. You never looked at me, Mrs. Winters, the way you look at the Duke even now, discussing wedding arrangements in your mother's drawing room. I am sorry if I caused you any false hope," Eleanor said sincerely. "Do not apologize," Lord Pembroke said, with more grace than she had perhaps credited him for possessing. "Genuine affection is a rare enough gift. I would not wish to see it denied for the sake of convenience or family expectation. I wish you every happiness, Mrs. Winters, truly." The wedding itself took place 6 weeks later, not in London's fashionable churches, where society expected such significant unions to occur, but in the small stone chapel nearest Ravensmoor Castle, surrounded by the misted hills and heather-covered glens that had first drawn Eleanor into Alastair's world during that fateful storm. The ceremony was modest by aristocratic standards, attended primarily by household staff who had witnessed the couple's growing affection firsthand, along with Eleanor's immediate family and a small handful of Alastair's remaining trusted relations. Margaret, the castle's loyal housekeeper, wept openly throughout the ceremony, later confessing to Eleanor that she had hoped for exactly this outcome, since the very first evening she witnessed the Duke's uncharacteristic concern for his unexpected guest. Colin, fully recovered from his broken arm, and now walking with barely a trace of his earlier injury, served as one of several beaming witnesses among the household staff, having grown genuinely fond of the widow whose courage had first drawn the household's attention months earlier. Edmund did not attend, having retreated following his failed schemes to a quieter existence, considerably diminished in both influence and ambition, his attempts at manipulation having cost him significant standing among the very relatives whose support he had once relied upon. The Duke, in a gesture of surprising generosity that Eleanor found deeply characteristic of the man she had come to love so completely, ensured his cousin retained a modest but sufficient income, unwilling to see even a man who had wronged him so thoroughly reduced to genuine hardship, though he made clear that any further scheming would forfeit even this small mercy entirely. Following the ceremony, as autumn light faded gently over the Highland hills, Eleanor stood beside her husband in the same garden where their forbidden embrace had first transformed the careful boundaries they had each maintained for so long. The old oak tree stood exactly as it had months earlier, its branches now nearly bare against the darkening sky, yet somehow the space beneath it felt entirely different now, no longer burdened by grief or hesitation, but filled instead with quiet, settled joy. "Do you regret it?" Alastair asked softly, echoing almost exactly the question he had posed months earlier beneath these same branches. "Everything that led us here?" Eleanor turned to look at him fully, understanding the weight behind his question, the vulnerability he had shown in asking it even now, secure as they finally were in their commitment to one another. "I regret nothing," she said firmly. "Not the storm that first brought me to your door, Not the grief that nearly kept us both permanently isolated from genuine happiness. Not even the fear that drove me to leave so hastily before understanding what I truly felt. Every difficult moment led us precisely here, Alistair, and I would not trade this outcome for any easier, simpler path. He drew her close then, no propriety or hesitation remaining to hold them back, and beneath the same ancient oak tree that had witnessed both their first forbidden embrace and countless quiet confessions in the months since, they shared a kiss that carried none of the guilt or uncertainty of that first, transformative moment, only the settled, joyful certainty of two people who had each believed themselves permanently closed to love, and who had found, against every expectation, that grief and loneliness could give way eventually to something entirely new and unexpected. Years later, when their own children asked how their parents had first met, Eleanor would tell the story of a broken carriage wheel and a desperate walk through Highland storms, while Alistair would speak of a determined widow who ran toward danger without hesitation, unafraid of wild horses or burning stables, or the quiet, wounded heart of a man who had convinced himself he would never again feel anything close to genuine love. Nothing about their beginning had followed convention or careful planning, yet nothing about their eventual happiness felt anything less than absolutely, irrevocably right, proof that sometimes the most forbidden beginnings led toward the most enduring and complete happiness, once both hearts finally found the courage to embrace what fate had so unexpectedly placed before them.